Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's review, we are jumping in yet again to a couple more Imperial Stouts. Today we've got two different brewers, so slightly different offerings here. We're going to be starting with the Central Waters Brewing Company's Rye Barrel Reserve Stout. This is an Imperial Rye Bourbon Barrel Aged Stout. Clocks in at 11.65% ABV. They are based out of Amherst, Wisconsin. And then number two, no stranger to most craft beer aficionados, we're going to move over to Mikkeller. This is their Beer Geek Breakfast. It is an oatmeal Imperial Stout that's been brewed with coffee. This one clocks in on the low end of the Imperial range at just 7.5% ABV. Mikkeller is a Danish brewer. They're based in Copenhagen, Denmark, though this specific beer is actually brewed in Norway. So we've got two completely different and quite a spread between their ABVs, but two completely different approaches to Imperial Stouts. One's just a plain Imperial Stout, but been barrel aged. The other is an oatmeal Imperial Stout that's had coffee added. So they're going to be completely different, and can't wait to jump in. I absolutely love Imperial Stouts of all kinds. So we're going to get started with the Central Water Brewing Company Rye Barrel Reserve Stout. That one clocks in at 11.65% ABV. Okay, so jumping right in with beer number one of today's Imperial Stout review, we have got Central Waters Brewing Company's Rye Barrel Reserve Stout. This one is 11.65% ABV. It has been aged in rye bourbon barrels. They're based out of Amherst, Wisconsin. Terms of label art, not really much to speak. It's very plain Jane. It's a nice clean design, but nothing particularly interesting. So not going to worry too much about that. Let's go ahead and get this cracked. All right, and poured right into the glass. We've got our purpose-built stout glass today. Okay, so at 11.65, this is actually quite a bit less thick on the pour than I anticipated to see. It formed an okay head. I should have been more aggressive earlier, but that's all right. Terms of color, as expected, it is absolutely pitch black once it's in the glass. It's very, very dark. Maybe it's thicker than it let on, and that's why it had trouble pouring the head. It was hard to tell. It looked lighter, which made it appear less thick as it was pouring out of the bottle, so that could have been my error. Nonetheless, it looks great. Head, I mean, happened. What happened? Let's give it a sniff. Oh. Oh yeah, that smells very, very nice. That's got a very pronounced aroma. You can smell a nice mix of the roasted malt. I mean, it's deep roast. You can smell that quite clearly. And that rye bourbon aroma just comes through. That barrel really did its part. If it's imparting that much aroma on there, it's so nice. I imagine it's going to have imparted quite a lot to the flavor of this beer as well. It's got that classic bourbon back. It's got a little boozy edge to it. You can definitely get some vanilla undertones in there as well, and it mixes very well with a deep roast malt. It smells fantastic. Nothing to wait to settle. Let's just jump right in for our sip. Mmm. Mmm. Oh. Oh, that's a lovely stout. Oh man, it's so good. It's so good. I love barrel-aged beers. I don't dislike non-barrel-aged beers, but barrel-aged beers, it's not something you want to drink every day. But frankly, there's just so many more layers of depth in terms of aroma and flavor. It just brings a whole nother element to the table. I absolutely love them. This is just fantastic. I can tell you that the malts in this beer are roasted to the level that is producing very strong dark chocolate and coffee undertones to it. And it just pairs so beautifully with that bourbon. It comes through quite strongly. That same bourbon aroma you get in the flavor. It really is quite close to what you smell is what you get, only you get some more interesting layering. I didn't detect really any of the chocolate or coffee when I sniffed it, but it does come through in the flavor, those malt undertones. It just smelled of deep roasted malt on the aroma. Now the kind of vanilla aroma that came through doesn't really translate into the flavor of the beer. You know, that's imparted from the bourbon itself, obviously, but I can't really detect it in the flavor profile, but I can tell you it's fantastic. This is a big beer. It is definitely a big beer. 11.65%. I mean, I expected it to be, and indeed it is. What I perceived to be not particularly thick, I was completely wrong. This is a big beer. It's got a lot of viscosity. Once you start to move it around the palate, it does get quite creamy, akin to a stout that would be pulled off of a tap at a bar. In terms of body, the body itself is actually not quite as robust as I anticipated for this ABV range. I would say it's medium heavy, but I don't think it's really encroaching into heavy territory. I'm going to jump in for another sip and see how these flavors develop. First, get it in your mouth. You were just whacked with that bourbon in that bourbon barrel. It's got this slight sweetness to it, very bourbony. It's got a little booziness to it. And it's not oppressive boozy. Some beers of higher ABVs, and particularly barrel-aged, can have an oppressive boozy presence where it just kind of drowns out all the nuance of the beer. This does not do that. It just accentuates it, in my opinion. And after you swallow, it just opens up. I mean, all of the flavors intensify. The bourbon intensifies, the kind of boozy quality intensifies, and then all of the malt qualities start to really just come in and just rock it out of nowhere. You get all the classic deep roast edge and then just layers of dark chocolate and this coffee undertone to it. It's fantastic. It's like a nice deeply roasted coffee. I wouldn't say it's French Italian roast like the really intense roast, but it's got a nice roast. It's a medium dark roast for sure that it reminds me of, kind of in terms of the coffee bean roasting. And it just intensifies, all those flavors kind of marry, and then it starts its very long, slow, steady descent, and it's got a very even sweep on the bell curve. The way that it kind of shapes up, though it does go a bit more linearly to the top, and then a nice even taper out to the bottom of the bell curve. It's very nice. Very long finish on this beer. It's quite wet. It's got a lot of viscosity. It's very pungently flavored, and it really, really does linger around the palate. I am left with just a boatload of bourbon lingering in my mouth in tandem with these deep, deep roast characters from the malt, and it's deep roast, very deep roast. So it's got quite a bit of difference to it. That kind of bourbon-y back, where it's almost got an implied sweetness and those undertones that the bourbon brings to the table, and then the opposite end with this ridiculously deep roasted malt. It's fantastic. This is a beautifully, beautifully balanced beer. I absolutely love it. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up my scores. When we come back, we will get to our second beer. This is the Mikkeller Beer Geek Breakfast, which is the Oatmeal Imperial Stout brewed with coffee, clocking in at 7.5% ABV. Okay, now moving on to the second beer of today's Imperial Stout review. We've got Mikkeller's Beer Geek Breakfast. This is an Oatmeal Imperial Stout that's been brewed with coffee. This one clocks in on the low end of the Imperial range, 7.5% ABV. Mikkeller is specifically based out of Copenhagen, Denmark, though this specific beer is brewed by Mikkeller in Norway. Admittedly, my knowledge of Norwegian is essentially non-existent, so I'm going to probably butcher this, but it says it's brewed and bottled by Mikkeller at Lervig Arctic Bryggeri in Norway. I'm just guessing at pronunciation there. I do not speak Norwegian. All right, let's get this one cracked. In terms of label art, they've got a French press and a beer glass there, and looks like some coffee cherries there. And it looks nice. It's a nice clean design on the label, but let's go ahead and get this one poured right in the glass. Ooh, that looks quite a bit thicker than I anticipated, no question. At 7.5, I didn't anticipate seeing that. This looks quite thick. Actually, it's pouring quite thick. Yeah, I was aggressive. I actually expected the head to form better than that. I didn't anticipate that thickness, but let's hold it up. Even though it's only 7.5%, I can tell you this is absolutely pitch black. You can't see a hint of light through this glass. Head formed okay. It's going to have decent cling on the side. That's about it. Let me give this a sniff. Oh, that smells fantastic. Wow. Yeah, that really smells nice. I'm not going to say it's the most pungent aroma in the world. You really got to get down in the glass, but when you do, you're rewarded. It smells amazing. Very deep, richly roasted malt, and a boatload of coffee comes through on the nose. There's also a slight sweetness to it and a little booziness to it. The sweetness kind of reminds me of a mix of, I don't know, maybe some kind of chocolate sweetness mixed with unroasted, coffee cherries, really kind of how it looks on the vine. It's got that same kind of quality about it. It's this almost fruit-like sweetness that's kind of interesting to describe. You would have to smell it, I guess, but yeah, it really is a fantastic smelling beer. Let's go ahead and dive right in. Oh, that's rich. That's a very rich beer. It's very coffee forward. This is a very nice stout. In fact, thinking on it, this stout reminds me a lot more of a more intense porter than it does your average stout. The characters and the flavors and the qualities that are coming through in this beer really put me in mind of a well put together porter. No knock on it at all. It's a great stout, and they're very closely aligned beer styles. The interesting thing is, even though it looked very, very thick pouring into the glass, I could tell you, mouthfeel-wise, it doesn't feel that thick and viscous. And indeed, the body doesn't feel that heavy either. It's for 7.5%, it's quite lighter in both of those realms than I anticipated. Another thing surprising, you've heard me mention this before, this is an oatmeal stout. So the lack of head creation and retention is quite surprising. That is the #1 best ingredient to put in a beer if you're trying to aid with head formation and retention. And it's always surprises me when I have an oatmeal stout that doesn't really do either. But they're all different. It's not an insurance policy. There's no guarantee it's going to happen. But let's go in for another sip. Body, I would say, is medium. It feels much lighter than you anticipate. Mouthfeel is not thick at all. It feels like a stout poured at home. It doesn't feel like one off of a tap. It's not super creamy, but it feels right. It's just not viscous like I thought it would be seeing it pour out of the glass. Flavor profile-wise, it's fantastic. The flavors are very intense. Get it in your mouth, and there is a little bit of sweetness. That hint of booze I could pick up on the aroma does not come through and translate into the flavor profile at all. Not at all. But there's a little sweetness up front, and then it starts to open into a myriad of flavors. Coffee, very deep coffee richness that pairs with the deep malt roast. And it doesn't put me in mind of the really deeply, deeply roasted coffee beans, but like a nice dark roast without being on the edge of burned. It doesn't impart any of that really deep, bordering on smoky quality, which you get with like a French and Italian roast. It's lighter than that, but it's concentrated. It's got a pungent coffee flavor to it. There are many chocolate overtones in this beer. It's predominantly dark chocolate, and there was a suggestion of semi-sweet chocolate that mixes with it, and I think it's coming from what I smelled is maybe unroasted coffee cherries. It's pairing with that, and that's where this kind of fruit-like quality is coming through. I don't want to say it tastes fruity, but it's deep and rich, kind of in that same vein. It's a little hard to describe. That's the best way I can put it into words. You would understand it if you drank it, but it's very, very nice. I'm going to jump in for one more sip to explore this finish and final thoughts. That is a tasty beer. It's that slight sweetness. It's just bam, malt, roast, and coffee. And then all the chocolate kind of overtones come into play. and that kind of rich, fruity sweetness. It really does put me in mind of unroasted coffee cherries. That's the closest thing it puts me in mind. If you've never had them, or chocolate-covered versions, that's actually really, yeah, that's what it's most closely reminds me of. Much more so than an actual fruit itself. It's like a coffee cherry. It's very, very nice. This is a very good beer. It's got a lot of depth to it. It's got a lot of layering to it. It's not ridiculous in terms of intensity here. It's very, very flavor and aroma forward once you get into it. But compared to, say, you know, a 10, 11, 12% ABV, it's not in that same playing field. It's the lighter end of the Imperial spectrum, but it's very, very nice. The finish is quite a bit longer than I anticipated, considering how non-viscous it is. It's really lingering around, and the dominant flavor that sticks is a combination of coffee and the various chocolate flavors that come through and the roasted malt. And it's almost an equal balance of just a single third between the malt and the chocolate hints, and then it's 2/3 coffee on top of that. That's roughly the ratio, and it really does last quite a long time, much longer than anticipated. I can still taste it. It's quite present all over my palate. It's delicious beer. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we're going to get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now it's time to get these really delicious Imperial Stouts ranked. Starting with the Central Waters Brewing Company's Rye Barrel Brewer's Reserve Stout. I believe it was the Brewer's Reserve. Indeed it is. This one is 11.65% ABV. Central Waters is based out of Amherst, Wisconsin. This was just a big Imperial Stout that's been rye bourbon barrel aged. Starting with the aroma, this was one of those beers that's very, very pungent. You can smell it from quite a distance. It does get a perfect 10 out of 10. Taste-wise, absolutely loved it. It was a rich, deep, multifaceted, really well put together Imperial Stout. And then they added on top of that the rye bourbon barrels, and it just kicked it up another notch. Perfect 10 out of 10 for me. Body on this. This had a very robust body, though pushing nearly 12% ABV. It wasn't quite as large as I anticipated. I did dock some points here, but it was still well above average. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Mouthfeel. This beer did have a good bit of viscosity, though again, given the ABV, I was actually kind of surprised it wasn't any thicker than it actually was in the mouth. It still felt nice, still very, very well above average. I only docked 1 point. It was close, but not quite perfect. I give it a 9 out of 10. Finish on this, very, very long. Every sip of this beer was very, very long. It just kept going and going and going, and all of those flavors that you were able to pick out as you were getting in your mouth and letting it roll around the palate, I mean, they stuck around to the very end, and you could still pick them all out independently. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Head and retention on this beer was not great, especially considering it wasn't as thick as I anticipated, and I was really being pretty aggressive on my pour. It just barely formed a head and it was gone. And retain, I mean, not that great at all. Just a little cling to the sides. It only gets a 3 there. Appearance-wise, this was textbook Imperial Stout, pitch black, 10 out of 10. Balance on this, beautifully balanced beer. Everything from all of the different malts that they put in there, as well as how long they kept it in the barrel. It was very well executed. Nothing really overshadowed anything else in the beer, and all of the players that came through and had their own voice, and it was from the start all the way to the finish. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Filling in the intangible. I loved this beer. I truly did. I thought it was a fantastic example of an Imperial Stout. I loved it. I gave it a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, this was a very, very well done beer. Absolutely a well done beer. I did dock some points, notably in the head and retention, but honestly, that aside, also keeping in mind it's not coming off of a nitro tap, it's poured at home. I thought that everything else about this beer was really just so well done, especially in terms of the overall experience, that I didn't dock points. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. That brings the total score to a 90 out of 100. Moving on to beer number 2, we've got Mikkeller's Beer Geek Breakfast. This is an oatmeal Imperial Stout that's been brewed with coffee on the low end of the ABV spectrum, 7.5% on this one. Mikkeller is based in Copenhagen, Denmark, though this beer specifically was brewed by Mikkeller in Norway. The aroma on this one was nice. It wasn't one of those that was so pungent that you could smell it from a great distance, but when you got near the glass, the aromas really came through quite strongly. It was well above average, smelled amazing, multi-layered. I gave it a 7 out of 10. Taste on this beer. I loved the way this beer tasted, honestly, and at 7.5%, I didn't actually expect the flavors to be as intense as they were, but they were, and they were very nice, and you could pick them all out individually just as you could in the prior beer. I give it a 10 out of 10. Body on this. The body on this beer, I was underwhelmed. 7.5% ABV is on the low end of an Imperial Stout, but that's still a healthy ABV that normally would have a pretty robust body. This really just seemed average to me, and I ranked it thusly. I gave it a 5. Mouthfeel, same thing. I really expected some viscosity. In pouring it, I was thinking to myself, wow, that really looks quite viscous. But it just wasn't anywhere near the thickness I anticipated. Again, another average category. It just gets a 5. Finish. Just as with the first, it was a very, very long finish on each sip. You could really continue to taste all of the flavors. They really lingered around the palate, and you could still pick them all out individually all the way to the end. Very long, wonderful. I give it a 10 out of 10. Head and retention, again, just like the prior, this one underwhelmed me. It is what it is pouring at home, but for the same reasons, it gets the same score. It gets a 3. Appearance-wise, I was a little surprised that this had the depth of deep blackness to the beer that it actually did. I mean, 7.5, it's still an Imperial, but it's not the biggest, heaviest, thickest Imperial you're going to come across, but it was indeed pitch black. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Balance. Balance on this beer was fantastic. The balance between the malt bill and the individual malts that they used in it and the coffee, I think that they struck a perfect balance. This was, a coffee-infused oatmeal stout, and I got to taste every bit of everything in a nice forward manner, and that's just how it's done. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. I really enjoyed this beer, but honestly, this one, the body and the mouthfeel were so dialed back that, frankly, I did have to dock some points here. I didn't dock many because it was still above average overall, for my opinion, but I've certainly had better, especially coffee and or oatmeal Imperials. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Still above average, though. Finally, as an example of the style, I think this is a good beer. I think it's one that many, many people would enjoy, but there were some categories where there were just too many areas where it didn't achieve top marks or close to it for me to rate any higher. I did still think that this is an above average example of an oatmeal Imperial Stout and also a coffee Imperial Stout, and certainly the two combined. But also bearing in mind the lower ABV, I gave a little leeway, but I still have to consider where it did lose points. I left it above average. I gave it a 7 out of 10 as an example of this style. And that does bring the total score on Mikkeller's Beer Geek Breakfast to a 75 out of 100. So two very different, those same category beers, varying ABVs by a vast margin, and we're looking at a 15-point spread here. Again, this is not an area where I'm going to say one of these is better than the others. Sure, objectively, by the numbers, one is, but really it all comes down to personal preference. They were both very, very good beers. I would easily buy either of these beers again to enjoy, and I truly mean it. I did enjoy both beers immensely. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you click the notification bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.